Ethan adjusted the collar of his diplomatic uniform, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that the room was watching him. The walls of the Zelari embassy shimmered softly, casting an iridescent glow. Ethan knew they weren't just ordinary walls. Rumor had it that they were bioengineered to monitor everything inside. Movement, temperature, and, if the rumors were true, even the emotions of everyone present. His fingers nervously brushed the collar again, as he couldn't shake the thought that the walls might be whispering to each other about him. This guy is way too sweaty to be a real diplomat. He cleared his throat and stood a little straighter as a group of Zelari diplomats filed into the room. Their towering forms moved with an unnerving fluidity, their robes shifting and rippling like liquid light. At nearly 7 feet tall, they made him feel like a scrawny teenager at a basketball tryout. But it wasn't their height that unnerved him. No, it was their eyes. Each Zelari had luminous, gem-like pupils that shifted between intricate, fractal patterns. It felt like staring into a kaleidoscope that somehow knew all your secrets, and for a moment, it made him forget how to breathe. Then she entered. Vaya. Ethan had read the briefing files, studied the political dossiers, but nothing prepared him for seeing her in person. Unlike the other Zeri, who radiated the composed authority of seasoned diplomats, Vaya carried an edge of something else. Curiosity. Playfulness. Trouble. All three, if the subtle smirk on her lips was anything to go by. Her emerald eyes met his, and for some reason, Ethan's brain short-circuited. Maybe it was the swirling irises, or maybe it was the fact that he'd been running on nothing but caffeine and sheer willpower for the past 24 hours. Either way, what came out of his mouth was, "You have great eyes." The moment the words left his lips, there was silence. Not just from Vaya, but from everything. The air itself seemed to tighten, as though the universe was leaning in, waiting for what would happen next. Vaya inhaled sharply, her pupils expanding, spiraling outward like blooming galaxies. "You see them?" she whispered. Ethan blinked, confused. "See what?" Vaya took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to something almost reverent. No human has ever perceived them before. Before he could ask what she meant, something strange happened. Her form shimmered, but not in any way that he could have predicted. There were no dramatic sound effects or sudden alien tentacle explosions, just a subtle transformation that made Ethan's stomach lurch. One moment, her skin was smooth and radiant like polished jade. The next, dozens, no hundreds, of spectral eyes blinked open across her arms, shoulders, and even along the delicate ridge of her collarbone. The eyes weren't grotesque. They were ethereal, glowing slits that shifted and refocused independently, watching, studying him. Ethan froze. His first instinct was to scream. His second instinct was to really scream. But instead, he let out a strangled, wide-eyed, "Oh, wow, that's a lot of eyes." A slow, eerie hush fell over the room. The other Zeri diplomats froze, their pupils shifting into unreadable spirals. Some exchanged glances. Others took measured steps backward, as if Ethan had just announced he was carrying a highly contagious virus. Vaya's voice broke the silence, soft and cool. "You are compatible." Ethan's heart raced. He stepped back, still reeling from the surreal transformation he had just witnessed. "Okay, let's hit pause for a second. Compatible? Compatible how? Like in a, we can sit next to each other on a spaceship without awkward small talk way? Or more like, my species and yours are now cosmically intertwined, and I've unknowingly accepted some sort of eldritch marriage proposal way?" Vaya tilted her head, studying him, her eyes blinking in eerie unison. "Unclear. That's not the word I was hoping for," she said. Before Ethan could ask what that meant, A deep, resonant chime echoed through the chamber, vibrating through the walls like a pulse in the bones. The Zelari delegates straightened their posture, their attention sharpening. Ethan's translator implant buzzed, feeding him a delayed interpretation. But the message was clear enough. Protocol invocation. Ancient rite of the first perception has been activated. Ethan's head was spinning. This was definitely not what he had expected when he signed up for this diplomatic mission. A Zelari elder, draped in robes that seemed to shimmer with ancient symbols, stepped forward. His voice was low and solemn as he spoke. The human has seen. It is written. He must stand trial. Ethan, already regretting every life choice that had led him here, let out a nervous laugh. A trial? That's probably just a cool Zelari way of saying, let's have a friendly chat over tea, right? Vaya didn't blink. Well, she did, but with about 50 different eyes at once, which was far more unsettling. No, she said simply. Ethan groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. Of course not. As the Zelari guards, tall and shimmering, moved to flank him, Ethan raised his hand slowly, trying to project a level of diplomatic calm he absolutely did not feel. Okay. Let's just take a breath here. I didn't mean to, perceive whatever I perceived. Can't we all just pretend this never happened? Vaya's expression softened slightly, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. That is not how our laws work. Well, our laws say I should have a lawyer present for this kind of thing, Ethan muttered, but the elder regarded him impassively. Your laws are irrelevant, the elder said flatly. Ethan sighed dramatically. Yeah, figures. Listen, as the guards began escorting him toward an unknown fate, Ethan glanced at Vaya and gave her a half grin. Any chance this trial ends with me getting a complimentary drink and a sincere apology for the misunderstanding? Vaya smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. Unlikely. Ethan muttered under his breath. Fantastic. Really feeling the whole interstellar diplomacy thing right now. And with that, he was led deeper into the Zelari embassy, unsure of what awaited him. Ethan was led deeper into the Zelari embassy, his mind still spinning from the strange events. He had been to many diplomatic events, met countless alien species, but nothing had ever come close to what he had just experienced. His heart raced as he was escorted into what could only be described as an alien courtroom. It wasn't like anything he had imagined. The chamber looked more like the inside of a bioluminescent jellyfish than a formal courtroom. The walls pulsed gently, translucent membranes shifting colors like a living mood ring. Whether the mood was ominous or mildly annoyed, he couldn't tell. The air was thick, heavy with an energy he couldn't quite explain. He shifted uncomfortably on the chair that had risen from the floor to accommodate him. It was warm, slightly damp, and unlike anything he had sat on before. He tried not to think too much about it. Across from him sat the Zelari elders, their gaze unblinking, their eyes swirling in intricate fractals that seemed to speak without words. Each one watched him with unnerving stillness, their attention focused entirely on him. Ethan couldn't help but feel small under their collective gaze, as though the eyes of an entire species were observing every twitch of his muscles, every shift in his expression. Vaya stood beside him, a figure of composed elegance, but Ethan couldn't ignore the dozens of spectral eyes watching him at all times. He tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering back to that moment when Vaya had transformed, revealing those hundreds of eyes blinking open all over her body. What did it mean? Why could he see them? The tallest elder, draped in living silk that rippled with unreadable glyphs, spoke first. His voice was low, but it carried a weight that made the room seem even heavier. Zelari elder, the human has seen. It is written. He must stand trial. Ethan couldn't suppress a nervous chuckle. A trial? What kind of trial are we talking about here? A philosophical test of wisdom? Or are we about to liquefy the human and call it a day? Vaya shot him a look, one that clearly said, "Shut up before you trigger another ancient rite." Ethan winced, but pressed on. I'm just saying, you guys have zero warning signs about reality shifts and whatever that was. He motioned vaguely, still half disbelieving. The elder did not respond, his face unreadable. Instead, another elder, smaller and draped in robes that shimmered like oil on water, gestured to the floor. Zelari Elder, the trial of the eyes must commence. It is the only path forward. Ethan rubbed his temples. All right, just so we're clear here, when you say trial, do you mean like some cool cosmic test of perception? Or are we talking more, oops, we accidentally liquefied the human kind of trial? Vaya paused for a fraction of a second, just enough time to make Ethan feel a chill run down his spine. The trial will test whether you are truly attuned to the deeper sight, she said. Whether your perception is a fluke or something greater. Ethan did not like how she phrased that. Fluke? He repeated, raising an eyebrow. But before he could launch into another round of sarcastic commentary, one of the elders raised a hand and the floor beneath them began to shift. The ground rippled like liquid glass and a circular chamber appeared below them. A soft hum filled the air and the walls of the chamber shimmered, refracting light in dizzying patterns. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, uncomfortably beautiful and unsettling at the same time. Ethan crossed his arms, trying to stay calm. He had no idea what was going to happen, but he knew it was about to get much worse. Okay, counteroffer, he said, forcing a smile. Instead of testing whether I'm some sort of magical human anomaly, how about we just pretend this never happened? I'll write a glowing report about the Zelari having really cool, really normal eyes, and we can all go on with our diplomatic lives. Vaya sighed, a noise that sounded oddly like a cosmic version of, I can't believe I'm dealing with this. The trial is not optional, she said, her voice firm. Ethan groaned. Of course it's not. With a gentle push from the Zelari guards, Ethan stood up and walked toward the shimmering chamber. His mind was racing. What exactly had he gotten himself into? The moment his feet crossed into the chamber, the walls shifted again. But not physically. More like they had never been walls at all, just an illusion of boundaries. Space unfolded around him like an alien flower, revealing something beneath it that stretched his mind and perception to its limits. Shapes, colors, patterns too vast for human thought. It wasn't just sight. It was understanding, raw and unfiltered. He felt as though 1,000 timelines were pressing against his mind all at once. He could see himself. No, versions of himself, rippling in the ether, choices branching out like rivers splitting from the same source. One version of Ethan had never stepped foot in this chamber, never spoken to Vaya, never seen what was beyond the veil. Another version had said nothing, looked away, had not perceived. And then there was something else. Something watching. Not just him. Not just the Zelari. Everything. Ethan staggered back, gasping. His vision snapped back to reality, the chamber's walls solidifying once more. The hum in the air faded, but the weight of what he had just seen lingered, suffocating him. Vaya was already at his side, her hands gripping his arms. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. I saw something else, he whispered, voice hoarse. Something beyond even you. The room fell into absolute silence. The elder's many eyes narrowed in unison. Vaya's expression shifted from curiosity to something far more unsettling: fear. Ethan had seen a lot of weird things in his life. He'd once walked in on a sentient gas cloud giving a PowerPoint presentation during a diplomatic conference on Titan. Another time, he'd witnessed a Martian bartender juggle 6 drinks with its prehensile tongue. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the sensation of an entire species staring at him like he'd just announced he could hear colors. Vaya's grip on his arm tightened, not painfully, but enough to make it clear that whatever had just happened was not normal. "You saw what?" she asked, her voice controlled but trembling. Ethan swallowed, trying to steady himself. "Something watching. Not just me. Not just you guys. Everything." One of the smaller elders, whose robes shimmered like oil on water, took a measured breath. "And yet he has." Ethan let out a dry, disbelieving laugh, still dizzy from the experience. "Cool. Love that for me. So just to be clear, am I like spiritually radioactive now? Is this one of those things where I start glowing and hearing voices before I ascend, or melt?" The elder gave him a long, unreadable look. "Unknown," he finally said. Ethan groaned. "Fantastic. Love the clear answers." Vaya turned to him, her face unreadable. "We need to leave." That got Ethan's attention. "Wait, leave? Where? Am I not on trial anymore? Did I win? Is there like a prize?" "No," she said, already pulling him toward the chamber's exit. "Something is wrong." The other elders didn't object. In fact, they seemed relieved, which only made Ethan more nervous. When ancient, hyper-intelligent species, ones who saw across dimensions, started acting weird, that was never a good sign. As Vaya led Ethan through the winding corridors of the Zelari embassy, the urgency in her movements only made him more nervous. His mind was still reeling from what he had just experienced. The trial. The eyes. The visions that had nearly torn his mind apart. He had seen something, perceived something, that no human should ever be able to comprehend. It was as though the veil that separated reality from something far darker had been ripped open, and Ethan had caught a glimpse of what lay beyond. He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in on him. The embassy, with its soft glow and eerie pulse, felt more alive than ever. Ethan could feel the air grow heavier with every step, thick with tension. The walls seemed to hum in sync with Vaya's steady footsteps as they moved deeper into the building. He could see her, her many eyes flickering in the dim light, each one scanning the surroundings with a careful, deliberate precision. He couldn't help but feel like he was being led to something far worse than he had ever imagined. Something that had already begun to unravel. "Something is wrong," Vaya had said. But what exactly was happening? What had he seen that had caused such a drastic shift? As they passed through the embassy's bioluminescent halls, Ethan's heart pounded harder. It wasn't just the Zelari embassy that felt out of place anymore. It was the entire universe. Everything felt off balance, like the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. "Someone needs to explain to me what's happening," Ethan said, breathless, trying to keep up. Preferably without using words like cosmic doom or irreversible existential rupture. Vaya didn't break her stride. She wasn't looking at him as she spoke, but her voice was steady, almost calm. "The veil is what separates our perception from what lies beyond," she said. "The Zelari evolved to see deeper than most, to perceive things that others cannot, but even we are not meant to see past it." Ethan's steps faltered for a second as he absorbed her words. "The veil?" he repeated, confusion written all over his face. Vaya finally turned to him, meeting his eyes. "You saw past it," she said softly, her expression unreadable. "And that's what's wrong." The air felt even colder now, and the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. Ethan could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had seen something. Something beyond the ordinary, something that shouldn't have been visible to a human. "I saw it," Ethan murmured to himself, the weight of the moment settling in. "I saw something else. Something watching." Vaya's eyes flickered again, her expression hardening. "It's always watching," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But it doesn't notice us. Not unless someone sees it." Ethan froze, his stomach lurching. "You mean when I saw it, it saw me back?" Vaya's silence said more than her words ever could. She didn't need to confirm it for him to understand. The thought of being watched by something that wasn't supposed to be seen, something that existed outside of the boundaries of his perception, made his skin crawl. But before he could ask more, Vaya's pace quickened. "We need to leave," she said sharply. Her hand grasped his arm, and he had no choice but to follow, as she pulled him toward the docking bay. The walls of the embassy seemed to vibrate, and the very air felt like it was distorting around them. Ethan's heartbeat quickened, but he didn't know what was worse: the strange, otherworldly sensation creeping over him, or the fact that Vaya's calmness was beginning to seem like the calm before a storm. When they reached the docking bay, it wasn't what Ethan expected. The area, usually bustling with activity, was now eerily quiet. The silence felt suffocating, oppressive. Then, something strange happened. Reality itself seemed to hiccup. The room flickered for a split second. Everything doubled: the walls, the ships, even Vaya. Ethan stumbled as the world seemed to snap back into focus. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, still trying to regain his balance. Vaya moved quickly, her expression hardening. She didn't answer right away, instead focusing on the ship in front of them. The sleek Zelari diplomat-class cruiser loomed, its iridescent hull gleaming in the dim light. Without a word, Vaya walked towards it, her every step calculated, her eyes scanning every corner of the docking bay. "We need to get off-world," she said, the urgency in her voice clear. Ethan followed her, still reeling from the surreal experience. The silence in the bay was suffocating, and the hum of the ship's engines, once a comforting sound, now felt more like an omen. As the entrance slid open, Ethan hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice shaky. The question had been nagging at him since the moment Vaya had pulled him away from the trial. Are we going to some wise sage, an oracle, or maybe a cosmic hermit who speaks in riddles? Vaya's eyes flickered at the mention of riddles, but her expression remained unchanged as she glanced at the ship's controls. "Not exactly," she replied. Ethan groaned. "Of course not." The ship began to move, its smooth motion cutting through the cold expanse of space like a needle through silk. The navigation system pulsed with symbols Ethan couldn't understand, but the destination was clear: something beyond the edge of known space. As they approached their destination, Ethan's anxiety deepened. The structure ahead of them was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't a station, nor a ship. It was something else, something alive. The architecture twisted and morphed, shifting in ways that defied logic. The structure was both organic and mechanical, glowing faintly with a life of its own. "That doesn't look like a place where people live," Ethan muttered, frowning at the enormous structure ahead. Vaya didn't respond right away. She simply exhaled, the weight of whatever they were approaching hanging heavily between them. "Because it isn't," she finally said. The ship docked with a barely perceptible shudder. The air inside the station smelled different, metallic with a faint organic undertone, like the breath of some vast, sleeping beast. Ethan hesitated as he stepped off the ship, the feeling in his gut telling him that he should turn back. But there was no turning back now. Whatever had been set in motion could not be undone. They moved down a dimly lit corridor, the walls pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to echo inside Ethan's chest. His mind was racing, his nerves on edge. What were they about to find? What was waiting for them on the other side of that door? As they reached the end of the corridor, the door slid open. Inside, surrounded by shifting strands of what looked like liquid data, sat the only other being who had ever seen beyond the veil. Ethan had expected something terrifying, a cosmic entity, a mysterious sage, or maybe some ancient, ominous figure. What he found, however, was a very tired-looking man. He blinked up at them, rubbing his eyes as though he hadn't slept in years. His hair was a mess, and his beard uneven. He looked less like an ancient oracle, and more like someone who had been awake for far too long. "Oh," the man muttered, barely acknowledging their presence. "They found another one." Ethan blinked, still trying to process what was happening. "Another what?" The man shrugged, as if it were no big deal. "Another idiot who saw too much." But Ethan stood frozen at the entrance of the room, his mind racing. He had expected to find some ancient cosmic being, some otherworldly entity that would explain what had just happened to him, what he had seen beyond the veil. But instead, he found a man, a human, or at least someone who looked human, tired, disheveled, and clearly not in the mood to entertain the strange visitors who had just walked into his world. The man glanced up at them with bleary eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He rubbed his face, stifling a yawn as he slowly sat up from where he had been slouched against the strange liquid data strands that surrounded him. His hair was wild and unkempt, his beard uneven. He looked less like a sage, and more like someone who had been awake for far too long, stuck in a constant cycle of nightmares. Ethan took a tentative step forward, still in shock, but Vaya stepped ahead of him, her presence commanding the room despite the bizarre circumstances. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of authority. The man squinted at her, his eyes focusing with great effort. He glanced at Ethan and then back at Vaya, as though the weight of their presence was more of an inconvenience than anything else. "I'm Malcolm," he muttered, rubbing his temples as if the simple act of speaking was taxing. "And I've been here longer than you think." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Malcolm held up a hand, cutting him off before he could ask any questions. "Look," Malcolm said, standing up slowly. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Everyone always does when they stumble into this mess." He stretched and groaned as though the very act of moving was painful. "But if you really want answers, you need to listen carefully, because time—" He paused, his face flickering with something like regret. "Isn't on your side." Ethan exchanged a glance with Vaya, who seemed unfazed by Malcolm's odd behavior. The way she looked at him, like she had known this man for a long time, yet with a hint of caution, only deepened the mystery. Malcolm sighed, turning back toward the strands of liquid data that pulsed around him, casting an eerie glow in the room. "I guess you both saw it, didn't you? The thing beyond the veil." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You saw it too?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Malcolm nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've been seeing it for a long time, longer than I'd care to admit." He paused, his eyes darkening. "Once you see it, once you truly see it, there's no going back. The veil, the thing behind it, it's not just a barrier. It's a prison. And the worst part is, we're inside it, all of us. Even the Zelari." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He tried to process what Malcolm was saying, but it didn't make sense. "What do you mean? The Zelari have seen beyond the veil, too. They have," Malcolm interrupted, his voice heavy with frustration. But they've never truly seen it. Not like we have. He waved his hand toward the pulsing liquid data around them. What you saw, what I saw, it's not just perception. It's something much darker, much older, and now that you've glimpsed it, you're marked. The thing beyond the veil is aware of you, Ethan. It knows you exist, and it's waiting. Ethan took a step back, his mind spinning. He felt a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. What is it? What does it want from us? Malcolm chuckled dryly, his gaze distant. What does it want? I don't know if it wants anything, but it needs something, and that's why it's been watching us, all of us, for so long. It feeds on our perceptions, on our fears. It grows stronger the more we see it. And now it's reaching out. The veil is weakening. Vaya's eyes narrowed, and she took a step toward Malcolm. How do you know all of this? How did you survive? Malcolm looked at her, his eyes hardening. Because I didn't just see it. I became a part of it. The veil doesn't just separate us from what's beyond. It holds us together, keeps us sane. When you tear that barrier down, when you truly see what's on the other side, it changes you. It twists you. That's why I'm still here. He looked down at his hands, as though the very thought of them disgusted him. I'm a link between worlds, between the living and the whatever that thing is. I've seen things you can't imagine, felt things that no human should ever feel. Ethan felt his stomach drop. But you're human, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You are human, right? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He just stared at his hands, as if lost in thought, then finally nodded, but his eyes were haunted. Yes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I was. But now I'm something else. Something different. A silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of Malcolm's words. Ethan didn't know what to say. The implications were too overwhelming, too terrifying. But Vaya spoke, breaking the silence. If you've been through this, then you know what happens next, she said, her voice tight. What do we do now? Malcolm turned his gaze to her, and for the first time, he seemed to come alive. You have a choice. You can go back, pretend you never saw anything, and live the rest of your life in fear of what's coming for you. Or you can step forward, into the darkness, and learn what it really means to see beyond the veil. Ethan felt his heart pound in his chest. What happens if we choose to learn? Malcolm's eyes gleamed with a dark amusement. Then you'll understand why the veil was put there in the first place, and you'll also understand why sometimes the truth is far worse than living in ignorance. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of Malcolm's words hung heavily in the air. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Do you have any other options? Vaya asked, her voice steady, though there was an edge of something deeper in her tone. Malcolm gave her a knowing look, as though he understood the hesitation in her question. No, there is no easy way out. The veil is breaking, and there's no going back. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the reality of the situation sink in. He looked at Vaya, who met his gaze with an unreadable expression. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. What's the first step? Ethan asked, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. Malcolm nodded, his tired eyes shifting toward the liquid strands surrounding them. You step forward. You see more. You blink back. The words felt strange, almost alien. But deep down, Ethan knew it was the only path forward. The veil was cracking, and they were the only ones who could stop what was coming. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Malcolm's words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Ethan's mind was still processing everything, seeing beyond the veil, the cosmic forces at play, the terrifying entity that was aware of him. It felt as though the universe itself had changed in an instant, and everything he knew was now in question. Malcolm's tired eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Ethan could see the vast, haunting knowledge behind them, the kind of knowledge that came with living too long in the shadow of something greater than yourself. Vaya stood beside him, her posture rigid, her many eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that Ethan could not yet fathom. She was calm, but Ethan could feel the undercurrent of something darker in her demeanor, something ancient. "Blink back," Ethan murmured, repeating the words Malcolm had said. "What does that even mean? How do we do it?" Malcolm's lips twitched in something that resembled a grim smile. "You're asking the right question, but the answer isn't simple. To blink back means to look deeper than you've ever looked before. It's not just seeing, it's understanding." He paused, as if measuring his next words carefully. "What you've seen, what you've touched, it's part of you now. And once you cross this threshold, you'll never be the same." Ethan felt his stomach twist at the thought. Never the same. He wasn't sure if that was a promise or a curse. "I'm not sure I can do this," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for. I don't even know what I've seen." But Malcolm regarded him with an intensity that made Ethan feel as though he was being weighed, measured, and found lacking. "That's the first step, admitting that you don't understand. But that's okay. No one does. No one who sees beyond the veil can ever fully comprehend what they've encountered." He glanced at Vaya, who seemed to be deep in thought, and then back at Ethan. "But you have to decide. You're either going to walk forward into the unknown and try to make sense of it, or you'll turn away. And I'll warn you now, if you turn away, you'll never know peace again. Not with what's coming." Ethan's mind was spinning. What's coming? The words felt like a final warning. "What exactly is coming?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking slightly. "What happens if I make the wrong choice?" Malcolm's expression hardened. "If you don't confront what lies beyond the veil, if you leave it unchecked, it will consume you. It will consume everything. The fabric of reality itself is unraveling. The veil was holding something back, something ancient, and now that you've seen it, it's waking up." Ethan stepped back, his heart racing. The weight of Malcolm's words hit him like a physical blow. He had only glimpsed the edge of something vast and incomprehensible, but now it was clear that it was far worse than he'd ever imagined. The reality he had always known was a fragile illusion, and if he didn't face what was coming, it would all come crashing down. Vaya stepped forward then, her expression unreadable. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. Malcolm nodded slowly, as if he had expected the question. "Now, you make the choice. You blink back, Ethan. You dive deeper. You'll be able to see what's behind the veil, what it truly is. The knowledge will flood your mind. But there's a price." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "A price?" "Everything has a price," Malcolm replied with a shrug. "Once you understand, once you see, you'll never be able to go back to the way things were. You'll see the world differently, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You'll be marked by it. It'll change you forever." Ethan swallowed hard. "But if I don't do this, then—" Malcolm cut him off with a sharp look. "If you don't, the thing beyond the veil will find you. It won't rest until it has you, and when it comes, it won't just consume you. It will consume everything. The universe will break apart. Nothing will be left." Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had 1,000 questions, but none of them seemed to matter anymore. The choice had been made for him the moment he saw beyond the veil. There was no turning back now. He had to see this through. "So what now?" Ethan asked, his voice steadying. Malcolm's expression softened slightly. "Now we move forward. We dive deeper. But understand this. Once we do, there's no going back. We'll be crossing into territory that no human should ever tread. But if you're ready, if you truly want to understand what's happening, then blink back, step into the darkness." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He turned to Vaya, who nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything. Ethan knew she had already made her choice. He looked back at Malcolm, the gravity of his words hanging in the air. "I'm ready." Malcolm smiled, though it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was one that spoke of understanding far deeper than Ethan could yet comprehend. "Then step forward," Malcolm said. "It's time." Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The liquid data strands surrounding him seemed to shift and pulse as if responding to his presence. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through his body, resonating deep within his bones. For a moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to make the final decision. And then, as if on cue, the veil parted before him. Ethan felt his mind stretch, his consciousness expanding as he blinked back. The world around him shattered into 1,000 pieces. He saw the threads of reality unraveling before his eyes, saw the vastness of the cosmos, the endless expanse of time and space. He saw the thing beyond the veil, an ancient, unknowable force, a presence that stretched across dimensions and realities, watching, waiting. It was more than just an entity. It was a concept, a force that transcended comprehension, a force that existed outside the boundaries of the universe itself. And then, as quickly as it came, the vision faded. Ethan gasped for air, his mind reeling as he stumbled backward, trying to process what he had just seen. Vaya was at his side in an instant, her hand gripping his arm, steadying him. "You've seen it," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of something darker. "You've crossed the line." Ethan looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the truth was clear now. There was no going back. The veil had been torn, and the thing beyond was waking up. The world around Ethan shimmered, flickering like a broken hologram. He was standing in the same room, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The walls of the alien structure seemed to bend and twist in ways that made his head spin. The liquid data strands that had surrounded him moments before now pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like the heartbeat of something alive, and something ancient. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. The vision he had just experienced, everything he had seen beyond the veil, was still fresh in his mind. The weight of it pressed down on him, threatening to crush him under its enormity. What had he seen? What had he become? He couldn't comprehend it fully. It was as if his mind had expanded to take in the universe's vastness and, at the same time, had been shattered by the knowledge that no human was ever meant to know. He felt as though he could still feel the presence of that ancient entity, watching him, waiting. Ethan stumbled, his hand gripping the cold surface of the liquid data strands, his legs shaking. His eyes darted around the room, but nothing made sense anymore. He couldn't focus. The edges of his vision blurred as his mind tried to process the flood of information that had just overwhelmed it. Vaya's voice pierced through the fog in his mind. "Ethan." She was standing beside him now, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel like she could see right through him. "Are you all right?" He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. How could he explain what he had just seen? How could he tell her that the veil had been torn, that the thing beyond had noticed him? That reality itself felt like it was slipping away from his grasp? "I don't know what happened," Ethan said finally, his voice raw. I saw it, and I can't even begin to understand what it is or what it wants." Vaya nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "You've seen beyond the veil. That's what matters. You've perceived it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Perceived? What do you mean, perceived?" Vaya took a step closer, her many eyes reflecting a deeper understanding than he could comprehend. "It's not just about seeing, Ethan. It's about understanding. You've touched something that no human was ever meant to understand." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "What does that mean for me? For us?" "Everything is changing," Vaya said, her voice steady. "Once the veil is torn, reality begins to unravel. Time, space, the very fabric of existence. It all starts to lose its meaning. The thing beyond the veil is awakening, and now that you've seen it, it's connected to you. It will follow you. It will watch you." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "And what happens if it catches up to me?" "It already has," Vaya said quietly. "You're marked. Once the veil cracks open, there's no escaping what comes through." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You mean it's already here?" "Not in the way you think," she replied, her voice tinged with something darker. "It doesn't need to appear. It exists outside of our understanding, outside of time. But it's here. It's always been here. It's just been waiting for someone to see it." Ethan stepped back, his mind reeling. "And now it's waiting for me?" Vaya didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be considering something, her eyes flickering in patterns that reminded Ethan of the alien fractals he had seen earlier. "Not just you. It's waiting for all of us. You're not the only one it's watching, Ethan. The veil has always kept it at bay, but now it's unraveling. It's connected to every being that's ever perceived it, and the more we see, the more it wakes up." Ethan's legs felt weak, and he leaned against the nearest wall for support. He had always known that there was more to the universe than what he could see. But this was something beyond his wildest imaginings. He had walked into a nightmare, and now there was no way out. "We need to act," Vaya said suddenly, her voice hardening with resolve. "We need to find a way to stop this. The Zelari are already preparing for what's coming. They've been preparing for millennia." "Stop it?" Ethan repeated, his voice trembling. "How? How can we stop something like that?" Vaya's eyes narrowed. "By understanding it. The Zelari think they have the answer. They believe there's a way to seal the veil again, to stop the thing beyond from entering our reality. But to do that, we need to go to the heart of it. We need to find the source." "The source?" Ethan asked, struggling to follow. "You mean where the veil began?" Vaya nodded. "Yes, the Zelari have a place. It's hidden, but they know where it is. If we can reach the heart of the veil, we might be able to repair the rift. But it's dangerous. No one who's gone there has ever returned." Ethan's mind raced. This was bigger than anything he had imagined, bigger than any political mission or diplomatic meeting. The fate of the universe itself seemed to rest in their hands. He looked at Vaya, who had already turned toward the door. Her expression was calm, but he could see the weight of what she was carrying. She wasn't just worried about the universe collapsing. She was worried about something even more personal. "You're not in this alone," Vaya said, as though reading his thoughts. She turned back to him, her eyes filled with something almost tender. "We have to do this, Ethan. The Zelari are our last hope. If we don't act, everything will be lost." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind still reeling from the implications of everything he had learned. But one thing was certain now. There was no turning back. "Let's go," he said, his voice steadying. "Let's find the source." Vaya didn't say anything, but the faintest of smiles tugged at her lips, as if she had been waiting for him to say those words. The two of them walked out of the room, into the unknown. The weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them both. The veil had been torn, and whatever awaited them on the other side would determine the fate of the universe. Ethan's heart raced as he followed Vaya through the dim corridors of the Zelari station. The ship had just docked at a secluded part of the structure, and now they were moving toward the heart of the veil. The walls around them pulsed with a strange, rhythmic light, like the heartbeat of a living organism. Everything felt alive. Too alive. The air felt thicker here, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. Ethan's mind couldn't settle, the thoughts swirling in his head. The images from beyond the veil were overwhelming. It was like trying to hold on to a dream that was slipping away with every passing second. But there was no time for hesitation. Vaya had told him that they had to reach the source of the veil, to find the core that held the fabric of reality together. She spoke of the Zelari's ancient knowledge, of a place where the veil had originally been created, where it could be repaired, if they could find it. The only problem was that no one had ever returned from the heart of the veil. The place they were headed was the very origin of the rift that had begun to tear the universe apart. "What exactly are we walking into?" Ethan asked, his voice low as they moved down the narrow hallway. His breath seemed to echo off the walls, adding to the sense of unease that clung to the air. Vaya didn't answer immediately, her eyes focused ahead, her expression unreadable. She had grown quieter since they began this journey. Ethan could sense the weight of whatever burden she was carrying. The same burden she had carried for centuries, perhaps. He wasn't sure if it was just the gravity of the situation or something deeper, something personal that she wasn't ready to share. "Ethan," she said, after a long silence, her voice tight. "The source is a place where reality itself can be rewritten. The Zelari believe that if we reach it, we can seal the veil again. We can stop the thing beyond from breaking through." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. The idea of rewriting reality sounded impossible, but they had already seen enough to understand that the impossible was becoming the norm. The thing beyond the veil wasn't just an entity. It was a force that existed outside of space and time. And the more they saw, the more they understood that the veil wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a wall keeping an unimaginable darkness at bay. "So, what happens if we fail?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vaya's eyes flickered to him for a brief moment, her expression unreadable. "If we fail," she said quietly, "the entity will be free. It will consume everything. It will erase us all." Ethan felt his heart drop. The reality of the situation was starting to set in. The weight of the universe itself was pressing down on him, and he was caught in the middle of it. No pressure. They reached the entrance to the chamber, a massive organic door that seemed to pulse in time with the rest of the station. The door wasn't made of metal or stone. It was something else. Something that breathed and shifted with every movement, as though it were a living part of the station itself. Vaya placed her hand on the door's surface, and it responded immediately, the pulsing light slowing to a steady beat. The door slid open with a soft, reverberating hum, revealing the space beyond. Ethan stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. What lay ahead was beyond anything he had imagined. The room was vast, stretching out into an impossible distance. It felt as though the space itself was infinite, expanding beyond the edges of his perception. The walls of the chamber were covered in intricate symbols, flowing patterns that shifted and changed as he looked at them. The air was thick with an energy that made his skin tingle. In the center of the room, a massive structure loomed. It was like a tree, but not a tree as he knew it. Its trunk twisted and spiraled, reaching out toward the ceiling like the tendrils of some alien vine. The structure seemed to pulse with life, its surface shimmering with an ethereal glow that rippled like water. At the very core of the tree-like structure was a sphere of light flickering with impossible colors, swirling in patterns that Ethan could barely comprehend. "The source," Vaya said softly, her voice filled with reverence. "This is where it all began. This is the heart of the veil." Ethan stared at the structure, feeling an overwhelming sense of awe and dread. The very air around him seemed to hum with power. He could feel the pull of the sphere, the strange energy drawing him in. It was as if the structure itself was calling to him, reaching out with a mind of its own. "We have to get closer," Vaya said, her voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "We need to reach the core. That's where the veil is weakest. That's where we can repair it." Ethan nodded, but a deep sense of unease settled in his chest. As they walked closer to the structure, he could feel the temperature drop. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the very fabric of space was beginning to warp around them. The closer they got to the core, the more disorienting the space became. The walls shifted, bending in ways that made his stomach churn. It was like they were walking through a living dream, a nightmare made real. When they reached the center, the sphere of light pulsed violently, sending ripples of energy through the room. Ethan's heart raced as he reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing the surface. The moment his skin made contact, the world around him seemed to explode into light. Images flooded his mind, visions of untold chaos, of stars being swallowed by darkness, of realities collapsing and folding in on themselves. He saw countless timelines, each one splintering and vanishing into the void. He saw the thing beyond the veil, not as a being, but as a force, a shadow that stretched across dimensions, feeding on the fear and confusion of every living being. Ethan gasped, pulling his hand back. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, but the sensation lingered, the weight of what he had seen still pressing down on him. "Are you all right?" Vaya asked, her voice tinged with concern. Ethan took a shaky breath, his hands trembling. I saw it. I saw what it is. It's not just watching us. It's feeding off our perception. It's feeding off me." Vaya's expression darkened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have to focus. We have to finish this." Ethan nodded, but doubt began to creep in. He didn't know if he could do this. The weight of the knowledge he had gained was too much to bear. But as he looked at Vaya, he saw the same resolve in her eyes, the same determination to stop the darkness from breaking through. Together, they approached the core, knowing that this was their only chance to stop the thing beyond the veil from consuming everything. The moment they touched the sphere, the fate of the universe would be decided.